The unit had taken 4 weeks to build. Diane Elaine Okafor had designed it herself, the way she designed everything she taught, starting from the question and working backward to the materials, then forward again through the sequence until every session connected to every other session, and the whole 4 weeks had the internal logic of a thing constructed carefully, rather than assembled from what was available. The question for this unit was who decides which lives get recorded and what happens to the lives that do not. Her students were 11 and 12 years old. They were in 6th grade at Pemberton Middle School in Arden Falls, Georgia. There were 31 of them, which was 2 more than district guidelines suggested for a single classroom, but the district had not added a section in September when enrollment came in high, and so 31 children sat in room 112 5 days a week and looked at Diane Okafor and learned what she had to teach them. She had been teaching at Pemberton for 15 years. She had started the week after her certification cleared in the August before Pemberton's first year of Title I designation, when the school had 411 students and a principal who was in his second year and a budget that covered the basics and not much more. She had been asked in her interview whether she was aware that the school's population was predominantly Black and Latino, and whether she had worked with high-need populations before. She had said yes to both because she had grown up 3 miles from the school and attended a school in the same district, and had been what this district classified as a high-need student for the first 11 years of her life. The principal had looked at her file and said, "Welcome to Pemberton." She had been there ever since. In 15 years, she had taught 743 6th graders. She had attended 62 parent nights, 47 IEP meetings, and 11 funerals, 3 of which were for children. She had written 315 recommendation letters. She had received the district's recognition award for classroom excellence in her 9th year, and again in her 13th. She kept both plaques in the storage cabinet behind her desk, not on the wall. She felt that a classroom with plaques on the wall suggested a teacher more interested in recognition than in what the room was for. What the room was for, she believed, was the work. She was 44 years old. She was 5'7" and had worn her hair natural for the last 11 years. She drove a gray sedan with a bumper sticker that said, "A reader lives 1,000 lives." She kept a thermos of coffee on her desk and a box of tissue on the windowsill, and a handwritten quote by James Baldwin taped above the whiteboard at an angle that was exactly 30 degrees from level, which her students found puzzling, until she told them she did it on purpose because the things worth reading are never perfectly straight. She was, by any measure she applied to herself or that her colleagues applied to her, one of the best teachers in the building. She knew this without pride and without false modesty, the way certain people know things that are simply true about them clearly, factually, and without the need to announce it. She brought this knowledge to the unit called Recorded Lives. The unit had 4 phases. The first week, the students read primary source accounts of Black American figures from the 19th and early 20th century. The second week, each student selected a figure and wrote a 5 to 7 page biographical account, focused not on the events of the person's life, but on what the person had decided to record and why and what remained when the recording was finished. The third week, they presented their accounts to each other. The fourth week was the field trip. The field trip was to the Arden Falls Museum of History and Culture, which had a permanent exhibition called Bearing Witness Documentary Lives in the American South, 1865 to 1965. The exhibition was organized around primary source documents, photographs, letters, legal filings, newspaper accounts, church records, handwritten journals, and early audio recordings. Each room was dedicated to a different period and method of documentation. The museum had been hosting school groups for 17 years. Diane had brought her class here for the last 12 of those 17 years. She had secured the reservation in September. She had submitted the chaperone authorization forms in early October. She had confirmed the bus service the week before. She had sent home permission slips 3 weeks ahead and followed up twice with families who had not returned them. She had also prepared her students for what they were going to see. She had spent 3 days in the third week of the unit showing them photographs of the exhibition rooms describing what each room contained and why it was organized the way it was. She had explained what a primary source was and why it was different from a secondary account. She had explained what it meant to look at a letter that someone wrote, knowing it might be the only record of what happened to them, or knowing it would outlast them, or knowing it would be read by people they would never meet in circumstances they could not predict. She had told them every document in that museum was a decision. Someone decided to write it, or photograph it, or file it, or save it. Someone decided that it mattered enough to preserve. And because they made that decision, we can stand in a room 100 years later and know that this life existed and that it had weight. She had told them this and then sent them home to write their papers. When the papers came in, she had sat at her kitchen table for 3 evenings reading them. She had read Jada Williams's 7 pages on Ida B. Wells and written in the margin, "Yes. This, exactly." She had read Devonte Marsh's account of Gordon Parks and the way he described the camera as a tool for making presence undeniable. She had read Marcus Wright's paper on Mamie Till and the open casket and the decision to let the world see what the world had done. She had read 28 more papers on 28 more people who had made decisions about documentation and what it was for and what it cost and what it preserved. She had thought reading them they understood. She had thought this is what the unit was for. By Thursday, October 19th, she had everything. She had 31 signed permission slips. She had a reservation confirmation from the museum's education department with a time slot of 10:30 to 12:30. She had 3 chaperone authorization forms countersigned by Pemberton's principal. She had a district transportation contract with pickup and drop-off times. She had the names, contact numbers, and emergency information for every child who would be on the bus. She had all of this in an envelope in her bag because in 15 years of taking children on field trips, she had learned to have everything on paper. She was not expecting anything to go wrong. She was also, because of what 15 years in this district had taught her, not entirely surprised when something did. The bus arrived at the museum at 10:17. She counted the children as they stepped off. 31. She confirmed her chaperones: Loretta Sims, James Carr, Nicole Webb, Deshaun Patton, Michelle Torres, and Paul Osei. She checked the time, 10:18. She had 12 minutes. The museum sat at the intersection of Calvert Street and Oleander Avenue in the historic district of Arden Falls. A wide set of granite steps led to a pair of glass doors with the museum's name etched across them. The steps were public. The sidewalk was public. The October morning was clear and cool, the light flat and gray, the kind of morning that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. She told the children to line up in their pairs. They did it because they were her students and they knew how to line up, and also because there was something in the way she told them that suggested today was a day when following instructions was not a thing they were being asked to perform, but a thing that mattered. They walked toward the steps. They were wearing their school IDs clipped to their jackets. They were carrying their notebooks. Jada Williams, who was 11 years old and had written 7 pages on Ida B. Wells, was walking beside her partner, Keisha Odom, in the 4th pair from the front. Jada had her backpack strapped on both shoulders, and her phone in the outer pocket of the backpack where she kept it every day. Because she was 11, and the phone was how she communicated with her mother when she was going to be late getting home. She was thinking about Ida B. Wells. She had been thinking about her for 3 weeks, and she suspected she would be thinking about her for the rest of her life. The way you think about someone who showed you something true about the world that you cannot unsee once you have seen it. She had read everything she could find. She had read the primary sources her teacher had provided, and then found others herself, staying late in the school library twice and asking the librarian, whose name was Mrs. Hawthorne, for help locating the original newspaper accounts Wells had published. Mrs. Hawthorne had found them and printed them out and handed them to Jada without comment, the way librarians hand things to children who are actually looking with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that the child knows what she needs better than an adult who hasn't read the same material could tell her. Jada had read the printouts at the kitchen table over 2 evenings while her mother made dinner. She had underlined things. She had asked her mother questions. Her mother, who worked as a hospital administrator and had a master's degree and kept her own collection of books about Black American history on the shelf in the living room, had answered every question and asked a few of her own. She had written 7 pages, and they were not enough. There was so much more she could have said about what it meant that Wells had chosen print when she knew what print cost her. About what it meant that the documentation itself was the act of refusal. The refusal to let a thing be done and then forgotten, as if the forgetting were the final part of the harm. About what it meant that the people who wanted the thing to remain undocumented were always the people who had the most to lose from the record existing, which meant the record was always a form of power, and the decision to make it was always a decision about who got to hold that power. Jada had written about this at the end of her paper. She had written Ida B. Wells understood that the most dangerous thing was not the thing that happened. It was the possibility that the thing could happen and then be denied. The record is what makes denial impossible. Her teacher had written in the margin, "Yes, this exactly." Jada was thinking about this when the officer stepped out of his patrol car. His name was Officer Gerald Pruitt. He was 36 years old, 6 feet 2 broad through the shoulders. He had been with the Arden Falls Police Department for 9 years. He had been assigned to the Historic District Patrol for 3 of those 9 years, which was a route he had requested because it placed him in a part of the city where event management was a regular part of the job, and where his specific understanding of which events required permits and which did not gave him a category of discretionary authority that he had found useful on multiple occasions. His record contained 2 prior complaints, one in 2017 from a resident in the downtown corridor who described him as having detained her on a public sidewalk without basis. One in 2020 from a business owner in the warehouse district who described a similar encounter. Both had been resolved without finding. In both cases, the department's review had characterized Pruitt's conduct as within his discretionary authority, which was a classification that meant the complaint had not risen to the level of a formal policy violation and would not be entered as a finding against him, but would remain in his file as an unresolved complaint. He had learned what that classification meant in practice. He had learned that the language of discretionary authority and procedural compliance deployed with the right tone and at the right moment was a tool that functioned reliably in the historic district where the sidewalks were public, and the permit requirements were technically complex, and the people he stopped rarely had the specific knowledge required to counter a confident recitation of ordinance language. He watched the group of black children walking toward the museum steps. He noted the teacher at the front of the group. He noted the pairs of children. He noted the school IDs. He got out of his car. He walked toward them. He said loud enough for the children to stop and look. "Hey, where are you taking these kids?" Diane Okafor turned. She noted the badge, the patrol car, the specific tone. She noted all of this in the 1 second before she began speaking, and she filed it and she kept her face level. She said, "Good morning, officer. We are a school group from Pemberton Middle School. We have a reservation at the museum for 10:30. Is there something I can help you with?" She said it the way she said things when precision mattered, clearly without inflection, with each word doing exactly the work it needed to do. Pruitt said, "Who authorized this many kids on this sidewalk?" She said, "We are on a public sidewalk. We have a school group reservation with the museum. I have the confirmation documents right here." She took the envelope from her bag. She held it out. He did not take it. He said, "I'm asking who authorized this event." She said, "This is not an event. This is a school field trip." The documents in this envelope include our reservation confirmation, our chaperone authorization forms, and our district transportation agreement. He said a group this size on a public sidewalk requires a city permit. She looked at him. She said, "We are a school group walking to the entrance of a museum we have a reservation at. Can you tell me which ordinance you are referencing?" He said, "Move your group to the side of the steps. You are creating a public obstruction." She said, "The steps are public access. We have 31 students and 6 chaperones walking in pairs. We are not blocking any point of entry to the building." He said, "Get your group out of the way or I will clear this sidewalk myself." Behind her, 31 children were watching. She felt them watching. She had been teaching long enough to feel the quality of a class's attention, and she felt it now, the specific, focused stillness of 31 people who had stopped thinking about where they were going and were paying full attention to what was happening. She thought, "I have 31 children watching me right now." She thought, "Whatever I do in the next 30 seconds, they're going to carry it." She thought, "They have spent 4 weeks learning about people who decided that the record mattered more than the cost of making it." She thought, "They are watching me decide." She kept her voice completely level. She said, "We are going to walk up the steps and enter the museum for our confirmed reservation. If you have a specific legal basis for preventing a school group from accessing a public museum, I would like to hear it stated clearly so I can document it." She said it with her eyes on his face. She said it the way you say something that needs to be on the record in front of witnesses, in the full understanding that the record is the thing that will matter when this is over. She was thinking very quickly. She was thinking about the 31 children and the 6 chaperones, and the fact that Reggie Foster was still in the bus and could see the encounter from the driver's seat. She was thinking about what the chaperones were thinking and what their hands were doing. She was thinking about the confirmation documents in the envelope in her bag and whether she should present them again or whether presenting them again would be interpreted as compliance with a demand that had no legal standing and therefore legitimized the demand itself. She was thinking about the 2 prior complaints in whatever file this officer had at the department and whether anyone had reviewed them and whether reviewing them had changed anything. She was thinking all of this while keeping her face completely still. She was also, somewhere beneath all of this, aware of the October morning air and the sound of traffic on Calvert Street and the smell of exhaust from the school bus and the weight of 31 children watching her back, and the specific quality of their watching, which was the quality of people who had not yet learned what to do and were trying to learn it right now from her by watching. She thought, "Whatever I show them, they are going to carry it." She thought, "Be careful what you show them." Pruitt said, "You are not listening to me." He stepped forward. He was significantly larger than her, 6'2" against her 5'7". He used the difference. He stepped forward until he was close enough that the children on the steps behind her could not see her face, only the back of her head and the broad-shouldered mass of the officer in front of her. He said, "I have jurisdiction over this sidewalk. Your group does not have authorization to be here." She said, "I have 3 chaperone authorization forms, a reservation confirmation from the museum, and a district transportation contract. Please tell me specifically what authorization you believe is missing." He raised his voice. He said, "You need to back up right now. You need to back up and get your group away from this entrance." He was not speaking quietly anymore. He was speaking in the voice that certain people use when they have decided to use volume as a form of force loud enough to be uncomfortable. Loud enough to attract attention, loud enough to suggest that the louder the voice, the greater the authority behind it. What he had not accounted for was who was behind her. Behind Diane Okafor on the granite steps of the Arden Falls Museum of History and Culture, something happened that no one had planned and that Pruitt had not anticipated, and that became in the weeks that followed the element that everything else turned on. 31 children reached into their pockets, not simultaneously. It started with 3. Devontae Marsh on the left side of the steps, who had done his unit paper on Gordon Parks and whose mother worked as a court reporter and who had grown up understanding that documentation was a professional act. Keisha Odom in the 4th pair, who had read her partner's paper about Ida B. Wells and had absorbed the argument about denial. Marcus Wright in the 7th pair, who had done his paper on Mamie Till and the open casket, and who had told the class in his presentation that the photograph was the decision to make denial impossible. 3 phones went up, then 6. Then a cascade arms going up across the steps, one after another, as each child made the same calculation in their own way and arrived at the same answer until 22 of the 31 had phones in the air, and the other 9 were looking at the 22 and making their own calculations. One of the 22 was Jada Williams. She was standing 4 steps up from the sidewalk. She reached into the outer pocket of her backpack where her phone was always kept, and she pressed record before she had fully articulated why, because pressing record in the presence of something that needed to be recorded was something her hands knew before her mind had finished the sentence. She pressed record the way Ida B. Wells had reached for a pen, not because she was sure it would matter, because she had decided it would not happen without a record. She held the phone steady. She pointed it at the officer. She did not put it down. She was 11 years old. Pruitt saw the phones. He saw 22 of them, which was more than he had ever had pointed at him in a single incident, which was a number that changed the quality of what he was doing, whether he acknowledged it or not. He saw children with their faces behind screens that were recording everything. What he said, the volume he said it at, the way he was standing relative to their teacher's 5'7" frame. He saw Patricia Elves. Patricia Elves was the education department coordinator at the museum. She had been doing this for 11 years. She had stepped out of the glass doors at the top of the steps when she heard the volume of the officer's voice from inside the building, because events near her institution's entrance were her responsibility, and because she had been coordinating school group visits long enough to know when something outside was not the ordinary noise of children arriving. She stood at the top of the steps. She looked at what was happening in front of her entrance. And then Pruitt did the thing that determined everything else. He reached for Diane Okafor's arm, not because he needed to, not because the situation required it, because he had decided something and he reached for her arm to make that decision visible and physical and undeniable the way a person reaches for something when they have concluded that the reaching is the point. His hand closed on her upper arm above the elbow with the specific deliberate pressure of someone using physical contact as a statement of authority, as a demonstration that this is what happens when a person does not comply. 22 phones watched it happen. Diane Okafor did not move. She stood exactly where she was standing. She looked at the hand on her arm. Then she looked at Pruitt's face. She thought, "This is the gut punch. This is the worst moment. This is the thing that is happening in front of 31 children and 6 chaperones and 1 museum coordinator and a dash cam on a patrol car that he probably does not think is capturing this." She thought, "Do not give him your reaction. Give the children your example." She thought, "They are watching me decide this, not whether to fight or give in, whether to be the person who decides that the record is what matters." She said quietly with a steadiness she could feel from the inside, like something being held in place by force of will, "I need you to take your hand off my arm." She said it without anger in her voice, not because she was not angry. She was more angry than she had been at any moment in 15 years of standing in front of children who did not yet know how angry the world was going to ask them to become. She was angry in the way people are angry when something expected still arrives, and is still every time worse than it should be. But anger was not what those 31 children needed from her right now. What they needed was what they had spent 4 weeks learning about the decision to stand in place to breathe, to let the record do what the record does, which is to make the thing undeniable. Pruitt said, "You are obstructing a law enforcement directive." She said, "I am standing on a public sidewalk with a confirmed museum reservation. I have not obstructed anything." He said, "I am going to detain you for questioning." From 4 steps up from the middle of the group, a clear voice said, "We are recording this." Jada Williams. She said it the way Ida B. Wells had decided to say the things she said without decoration, without trembling, with the specific authority of someone who has thought carefully about what it means to speak and has decided to speak anyway. She said, "We are all recording this." 22 phones, not lowered, not wavering, pointed at the officer's face, at his hand on their teacher's arm, at the 4 seconds of silence that followed Jada's voice. Pruitt turned to look at the steps. He looked at the phones. He looked at Jada Williams, who was 11 years old and not moving. He looked at Patricia Elves at the top of the steps. He looked at Reggie Foster, the bus driver, who had stepped out of the bus when the volume increased and was standing on the sidewalk with his own phone now raised. He looked at his hand. He released her arm. He stepped back. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the phones again. He looked at Patricia Elves, who had come down 2 steps. and was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has 11 years of experience with this institution and is forming a very specific opinion about what she is going to do next. She said from the steps, "Can I help you, officer? These are our scheduled guests. They have a confirmed reservation." She said it evenly, the way professional people say the thing that needs to be on record. Pruitt looked at her. He looked at Diane Okafor, who had not moved, whose arm bore the fading pressure of his hand, whose face showed nothing that he could use against her. He looked at the phones. He looked at 22 phones held steady, pointed at him in the hands of children who ranged in age from 11 to 12, and who had not lowered them and had not moved, and who were looking at him through their screens with the specific, focused patience of people who have decided something and are not going to undecide it. He thought about what 22 videos of this encounter would look like. He thought about what was on them. He thought about his hand on this woman's arm and the volume of his voice on a public sidewalk in front of a museum entrance, and the 31 students who had witnessed everything from the first word he spoke, and the 31 phones in the outer pockets of 31 backpacks, 22 of which were now in the air. He had used the procedural language and the confidence and the physical presence and the volume. He had applied everything that had worked before. What he had not encountered before was this children who had spent 4 weeks learning exactly what they were looking at, who understood why the record mattered, and who had reached for their phones before he finished his third sentence. He said to no one specifically, "I am documenting this interaction." He said it in the tone of a person who has run out of moves and has found only one word left, which was the word documentation, which was the exact word being used against him. He walked back to his patrol car. He got in. He sat there. He sat for 4 minutes and 20 seconds on Oleander Avenue. He did not drive away. He sat there, visible through every windshield and from every raised phone, and the phones were still recording, and every second of those 4 minutes and 20 seconds was captured. The quality of a man who has just understood something about what he has done and has not yet decided what to do about understanding it. The quality of a man who thought he was in control of a situation and has discovered that 22 11-year-olds have been in control of it since the moment they decided to press record. He started the engine. He pulled into traffic. He drove away. Patricia Elves came down the steps and stood beside Diane. She said softly, "I am so sorry. Are you all right?" Diane said, "Yes, I am all right." She was not entirely certain this was true. Her arm was fine. The rest of her was somewhere between fine and something that was going to require time and privacy to fully process, neither of which she had right now. She had 31 children and 6 chaperones and 12 minutes to a confirmed reservation and a 2-hour museum visit to conduct, and the specific professional habit of 15 years that told her the children's experience of this morning was not over, and that how the next 12 minutes went would be part of what they carried from it. She breathed. She thought about the photographs in the exhibition they were about to enter. She thought about the first room panel, the church in Georgia in 1932, the hand-lettered sign. She thought about Samuel Tobias in Alabama in the 1890s, writing letters that were never going to be answered and writing them anyway. She thought about Mamie Till choosing to let the world see, and Ida B. Wells choosing to put it in print, and the long line of people who had stood in something difficult and decided that the record mattered more than the difficulty. She thought, "I am standing in that line right now." She thought, "Stand up straight." She turned to the group. She said, "We have 12 minutes until our reservation time. Let us go inside." And they went inside. They went in because their teacher said to go in. They went in because they had spent 4 weeks on a unit about what it means to decide to document something, and they had just done it. And now the thing the unit had been building toward was waiting inside. And there was not a single child on those steps who did not understand in their bones that going inside was the right next thing. Patricia Elves held the door. Diane Okafor walked through last. Inside it was quiet and cool and lit the way museums are lit, carefully, precisely, with the specific attention to objects that makes the objects feel important, and the experience of standing near them feel like a responsibility. Diane looked at the first panel of the exhibition. She breathed. She thought, they did the right thing. She thought, now I have to figure out what comes next. She stepped away from the group while the docent began the guided walk. She found a quiet corner near the museum's information desk. She called the school principal. Carolyn Mace answered on the second ring. Diane described the incident in the specific, sequential, undramatic way she described things when she needed them on record: the officer's badge number and name, the precise time of first contact, the exact words he had used to demand. They moved the ordinance language he had cited without specifying a code section. Her response and his escalation. The physical contact with its exact duration and location. The children's response. Patricia Elves's arrival and statement. The chaperones and the bus driver and the 22 student recordings, which she described as follows. 22 students raised their phones and recorded everything from the first escalation through the officer's departure, approximately 15 minutes of footage from 22 separate angles. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are the children okay?" Diane said, "They are inside the museum looking at the exhibition. They are okay. I think they did something remarkable on those steps." She said it the way she said things she meant without elaboration, simply, as a fact. Carolyn was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "I think so too. I am going to be honest with you. I think what happened on those steps is going to be part of this for a long time. Are you okay to continue the visit?" Diane said, "Yes, I'm okay to continue." Carolyn said, "Then continue. Keep the receipts. All of them. I am calling the district office now, and I will have someone from legal on the phone before your bus gets back. Do not delete anything from your phone, and ask each chaperone individually not to delete anything from theirs. Get their names and phone numbers confirmed before you leave the museum, so we have them on record." She said, and Diane. She said, "You did the right thing. On the steps, and in here, and in keeping this call factual. All of it was the right thing." Diane said, "Thank you. I'll call you when we're back on the bus." She ended the call. She stood still for the moment in the corner near the information desk. She breathed. She thought about how the call had gone. She thought about saying the words, "The officer put his hand on my arm," and how those words had sounded when she said them. Matter-of-fact, sequential, documented. She thought about how different that was from how those words felt when they were happening. She thought about the difference between the record and the experience, which was a difference she had been teaching her students about for 4 weeks, and which she was now understanding from the inside, in a way she had not fully understood it from the outside. She thought, this is the lesson. She thought, not the unit. This. The fact that the record and the experience are not the same thing, and the record matters anyway, and the decision to make the record is always a choice, and the choice is always made by a person who is also feeling something, and the something they are feeling is not a reason not to make the record. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the wall in front of her. It was a photographic series from 1932. A church in rural Georgia, one room with a hand-lettered sign above the door. The sign said, "Records Matter." She looked at it for a long time. She went to find her students. She found them in the second room, standing in front of a glass case containing the letters of a man named Samuel Tobias, who had been a school teacher in Alabama in the 1890s, and who had spent 20 years writing letters to every legal institution, journalist, and political figure he could reach, documenting what he witnessed in his county. Most of the letters had never received a reply. 3 of them had. The exhibition noted that the 3 replies had not changed the things Samuel Tobias was documenting. The exhibition also noted that the letters had survived and that Samuel Tobias had known they would, and that he had written them anyway. The room smelled of museum air, climate-controlled, clean faintly of old paper. The light was the amber of careful curation. The glass cases had small identifying placards. The placards had dates. The dates were all in the past, which was the point. The distance between then and now was the thing the exhibition was measuring, and the letters in the cases were what made the distance measurable. Jada Williams was standing closest to the case. She was reading the letters, not the exhibition text about the letters, the actual letters behind the glass. Handwritten, the ink faded but legible. the penmanship careful in the way handwriting is careful when a person understands that this page may outlast them, and it should be possible for someone to read it accurately 100 years from now. Diane stood beside her. Jada said without looking up. He knew they weren't going to write back. Diane said most of them. Jada said, but he wrote them anyway. Diane said, he wrote them anyway. Jada was quiet for a moment. She was looking at one letter in particular. It was addressed to a federal circuit court. It described a specific incident in specific language. Names, dates, locations, what was done and by whom, and in the presence of how many witnesses. The letter was 8 pages. The letter had a case file number written in the margin in a different hand, which meant it had been received and logged. The letter had no reply in the archive beside it. Jada looked at the letter for a long time. Then she said, "That's what I was doing on the steps." Diane looked at her. She said, "Yes, that is exactly what you were doing." She said it simply without elaboration because it was true, and because Jada was 11 years old and had just done something that many adults never manage, which is to understand an abstract principle and then act on it in real time in a difficult moment with 21 classmates watching and making the same choice beside her. And what that deserved was not a speech, but a simple acknowledgement from the person who had spent 4 weeks building the path that led here. Jada said, "I pressed record before I thought about it," Diane said. "That is how it works when you've really learned something. When you've learned it all the way through, you don't need to think about it. It's already in your hands." The class continued through the exhibition. They saw a room dedicated to the documentary photographs of Gordon Parks and the way Parks had used his camera not as a passive observer, but as an active argument about what existed and what deserved to be seen. They saw a room about the legal documents filed by black families in the South during Reconstruction, each filing a decision to insist that the law was real, even when the people enforcing it did not act as if it were. They saw a room about the oral tradition, the recordings made in the 1930s and 40s by folklorists who had gone into communities and captured the voices of people whose voices were not being captured anywhere else. The children were quiet through most of it, not the polite quiet of children enduring something adult. The particular quiet of children who are processing something that is connecting to something else they already know. Marcus Wright stood for a long time in front of the photograph of Emmett Till's open casket. He had written his paper about this. He had written about Mamie Till's decision. He stood there and said nothing. Devontae Marsh found the section on Gordon Parks and stood very close to one photograph in particular, a woman in a domestic worker's uniform standing in a kitchen looking directly at the camera. Not performing, not posing. Looking the way people look when they have decided to let the photograph carry the truth instead of carrying it themselves. He said quietly, "She trusted the camera." The docent who had been leading school groups for 7 years heard him say it. She looked at him. She said yes. She did. And the photographer trusted himself to carry what she gave him. Devontae thought about this for the rest of the tour. At 12:15, the class gathered in the lobby for the summary session. Patricia Elves and the docent thanked the group and asked if anyone had questions. 12 hands went up. The questions were specific. How had the letters of Samuel Tobias survived 130 years? What had happened to Gordon Parks' original negatives when the magazines that had published the photographs closed? Had any of the legal documents the families filed during Reconstruction ever been cited in a later legal proceeding? They were the questions of people who had been paying attention and who understood that the details mattered, not just the stories, but the survival of the stories, the chain of custody, the question of who kept a thing and why and what happened to the thing after the keeper was gone. Patricia Elves answered every question. The docent answered too. A museum archivist who happened to be passing through the lobby stopped when she heard the questions and answered 3 more, including a detailed account of how the Tobias letters had come to the museum through a donation from a descendant who had kept them in a box under a bed for 60 years, not knowing what they were or who had written them, only knowing that they were her grandfather's letters and that her grandfather had said they mattered. Patricia Elves, watching the archivist answer, found herself looking at Diane Okafor, who was standing at the back of the lobby with her arms folded, and her expression the specific expression of a teacher watching a moment land exactly where she had placed it 4 weeks ago. She thought this teacher came here with children who were already prepared. She thought what happened on the steps was not separate from this. It was the same thing. The class filed out, down the granite steps. Diane was last again. She put her hand briefly on the doorframe as she walked through it, and then walked down the steps to the sidewalk where the bus was waiting, and did not look at the spot on the Oleander Avenue curb where the patrol car had been. Reggie Foster counted the children as they boarded. He closed the door. The bus pulled out onto Calvert Street. On the bus, for the first several minutes, no one spoke. The October light through the windows was the same light it had been 2 hours earlier. Flat and gray. The light of a morning that makes things look permanent. The children sat in their pairs with their school IDs on, and their notebooks in their laps, and the particular quality of quiet that comes after a 2-hour museum visit that changed something about how you understood the world you had already been living in. Then Jada Williams said to Keisha in the seat beside her, "Do you think the videos matter?" Keisha said yes. Jada said, "How do you know?" Keisha said, "Because he let go." She said it simply. She meant when the phones went up, he let go. When the record became visible, the thing the record was capturing stopped. Not because he suddenly became a different person. Because the cameras were there and he understood that the cameras were there and he understood what was on them. Keisha said, "That's what the letters were for. They were for making it so the thing couldn't just not exist." Jada thought about Samuel Tobias writing letters to federal circuit courts that never replied. She thought about the letter in the glass case with the case file number in a different hand. Someone had logged it. Someone had received it and opened it and written a number on it and filed it, and then not replied. And the letter had survived anyway in a box under a bed for 60 years, and had ended up in a glass case in a museum in Arden Falls, Georgia, where 11-year-olds could stand and read it. She thought about this for the rest of the ride. She posted her video at 12:47, 40 minutes after the class returned to Pemberton. She wrote with it, "My teacher was trying to take us to the museum. We were not going to let them pretend it did not happen." By 4 in the afternoon, the video had 46,000 views. By 8 in the evening, it had been shared to 3 regional news accounts and a local television station that ran it on the evening broadcast with a segment called "Students Defend Teacher at Museum Entrance." By the following morning, it had 212,000 views, and the school's main office phones had been ringing since before the first bell. There were 22 videos in total. Taken together, they documented every moment of the encounter, what Pruitt said and the volume at which he said it, his hand on Diane Okafor's arm, and the duration of the contact, the 4 minutes and 20 seconds he sat in the patrol car after releasing her, Patricia Elves coming down the steps, Reggie Foster standing on the sidewalk outside the bus, and the moment Diane turned to the children and said, "We have 12 minutes until our reservation time. Let us go inside." And they captured the moment in Jada Williams's video, 37 seconds after Pruitt releases Diane's arm when the camera swings briefly away from the officer and toward the group on the steps. For 4 seconds, it shows the other 21 phones in the air. It shows the children's faces behind the phones, focused, deliberate, unafraid, the specific expression of people who have made a decision and are carrying it out without assistance from any adult. A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution-Journal wrote about the incident 3 days after it occurred. She had watched all 22 videos and had interviewed Jada Williams's mother, who had provided written consent for her daughter to be quoted. She had interviewed Patricia Elves and 2 of the chaperones. She had not been able to reach Pruitt, who had declined through the department's public affairs office. She focused her article on that 4-second clip. She wrote, "In 4 weeks of study, they had learned what documentation was for. On a Thursday morning, on a public sidewalk, they found out if they believed it. The answer from 22 11-year-olds was yes." She also wrote something that received more attention than the rest of the article combined. She wrote, "The teacher did not ask them to record. She did not signal them, did not instruct them, did not suggest it with a look or a gesture that the video would have captured. They reached for their phones because they had spent 4 weeks being taught by someone who understood why the record mattered, and because they had understood it, and because in the moment that understanding was tested, they acted on it without being asked. That paragraph was shared separately from the rest of the article. It was shared 48,000 times over 3 days. People shared it with single lines attached. This is what teaching looks like. This is what learning looks like. This is what they were ready for because someone prepared them. Carolyn Mace read it in her office on a Friday morning and closed her laptop and sat for a moment. She had been principal at Pemberton for 6 years. She had hired Diane Okafor into a department head position in her 4th year. She had been to one of the field trips herself in the 2nd year of her tenure, and had watched Diane move through the exhibition with 31 children, the way certain teachers move through material they have built not guiding but accompanying, not explaining but pointing, trusting the children to arrive at the thing themselves if the path was made available to them. She had thought, then this is what the best teachers do. They build the path, and then they walk beside you on it, and they trust you to understand what you find. She sat for a moment in her office on that Friday morning. Then she picked up the phone and called Diane. She said, I want you to know that I have read everything. All of it. The reviews, the articles, the social media. I want you to know that none of it surprised me. I want you to know that what happened on those steps was the unit. It was the end of the unit. They learned the thing you were teaching, and then they had the opportunity to live it, and they did. Diane was quiet for a moment. She said, I didn't plan for it to happen that way. Carolyn said, no, but you planned them to be ready if it did. That's the difference. There was a pause. Carolyn said, the district has approved a letter of commendation for your file. The board voted unanimously last night. Diane said, thank you. She said it the way she said things she meant simply without elaboration directly. She said, I'll be in my room at 7:30 Monday morning. Carolyn said, I know you will. You always are. She paused. She said, Diane, for what it's worth. I have been a principal for 6 years. I have been in education for 22. I have never seen a classroom unit produce a moment like the one on those steps. And I want you to know that I understand it didn't happen by accident. It happened because you built something that worked, Diane said quietly. It worked because they were ready. I just made sure they had something to be ready with. There was a silence. Then Carolyn said, that's what teaching is. And Diane said yes, and that was all that needed to be said. The district superintendent convened an emergency meeting within 24 hours of the initial broadcast. The school board chair issued a public statement. The city council held a special session. The police chief appeared before it and said that the department took the matter seriously and that a review had been opened. The review took 3 weeks. The internal review was opened the following morning. The review examined 22 student videos, 3 chaperone videos, the museum's external security footage, the patrol car dash cam, Pruitt's body cam footage, his radio log, his 2 prior complaint files, and written statements from Diane Okafor, Patricia Elves, all 6 chaperones, Carolyn Mace, Reggie Foster, and the museum, and the E. The review also examined Pruitt's deployment history in the historic district over the 3 years he had been assigned there. The data showed 14 separate instances in which he had used the permit and ordinance language to delay or disrupt groups on public sidewalks in the historic district. Of those 14 instances, 12 involved groups that were predominantly or entirely Black or Latino. 2 involved white groups. Of the 2 involving white groups, both had immediately produced valid permits and been allowed to proceed in under 3 minutes. Of the 12 involving Black or Latino groups, the average duration of the encounter was 9 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 of the 12 had resulted in the group dispersing without accessing their intended destination. That data was entered into the review record. It was entered next to 2 prior complaints, both resolved without finding, and 1 body cam activation timestamp that was 11 minutes and 40 seconds late. The body cam footage was the critical document. Pruitt had not activated his camera until the moment he released Diane's arm. The body cam had been running for 11 seconds when it captured him stepping back. It had not captured the initial verbal confrontation, the escalation, or the physical contact. The department's policy required activation at the initiation of any civilian contact. His camera had activated 11 minutes and 40 seconds into the incident. That gap was entered into the record. It was entered next to 22 student videos that contained no gaps at all. The review board examined the prior complaints. 2 complaints, 2 resolutions without finding, and the current incident, a pattern designation, was entered. Pruitt received a formal finding of excessive force and harassment, suspended with pay pending a disciplinary hearing. The union grieved the suspension. The grievance was reviewed. It was denied. The disciplinary hearing produced a 30-day unpaid suspension, mandatory bias, recognition training, mandatory body cam compliance training, and a formal finding in his permanent record. His shift supervisor received additional training on incident reporting protocol. The 2 families whose prior complaints had been classified as resolved without finding were notified by the department's community liaison officer. One of them wrote back. Their letter was 2 pages. It described what had happened to them, how they had submitted their account, how the classification had felt when it arrived, what their children who had been present were doing now. It described what it meant to receive a letter years later saying that the record had ultimately mattered. The department placed the family's letter in its community relations archive. The archive keeps records. In the weeks that followed Diane, Okafor received over 300 letters and messages from teachers, parents, former students, and people she had never met who had seen the video and wanted to tell her something. Some of them were from teachers who had seen the 4-second clip and cried. Some were from parents who had shown it to their children. Some were from former students of hers who were now in high school or college, or working, who had tracked down her school email and written to say, "I was in your class in 2014, or 2018, or 2020, and I want you to know that what I saw in that video was something I recognized from being in your room. I recognized it because you had already taught us what it looked like." She read all of them. She did not respond to most of them, not because she did not want to, but because the responses that felt true to her were the ones that required more time than she had, and the ones that did not require time were not the responses that felt true. She responded to the ones from teachers. She responded to every teacher who wrote to her. There were 64 of them. Some were asking how to design a unit like the one she had built. Some were asking what to do when something like October 19th happened to them. Some were asking more quietly how to stand still when a man's hand is on your arm and 31 children are watching. She wrote back to all 64. She told them you design the unit so that the question is real and the materials require them to decide something. You keep the documentation because documentation is the record, and the record is the power. You stand still because the children need to see you decide what matters more than your own fear, and if you can do that in the moment, they will carry it. She told them I had been teaching this unit for 12 years. This was the first year it happened in front of me instead of in a book. She told them I was afraid. I was afraid, and I stood still anyway, and I want every teacher to know that both of those things can be true at the same time. And the second one is the thing that matters. On the first Thursday of November, 2 weeks after the incident, Diane taught her class their next unit, mathematics. She had added one thing to the materials. On the first day of the new unit, she distributed to each student a printed copy of a photograph from the Bearing Witness exhibition, The Church in Rural Georgia, from 1932, with the hand-lettered sign above the door. She said, "I thought we should have it in the room." She did not say anything else about it. She began teaching mathematics. Jada Williams was in the 3rd row, 4th seat. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the sign. She thought about Ida B. Wells pressing pen to paper and about what it means to decide that something will be known. She looked at her teacher. She took out her notebook. She did not record what happened next. What happened next was a mathematics lesson, and it did not need recording. It simply needed to happen the way things happen in rooms where someone has been building something for 15 years, and the children know it is there even when they cannot name it. The Bearing Witness exhibition ran through the spring. Diane brought 2 more classes before it closed. She brought them on Thursday mornings in their pairs up the granite steps through the glass doors. She had the confirmation documents in an envelope each time. She always had them. On the second visit, the museum had added something to the entrance hall. It was a small mounted photograph printed large in a frame near the main exhibition signage. It showed the granite steps of the museum entrance in October morning light, taken from inside the glass doors looking out. 22 phones in the air, 22 children's faces behind them. In the foreground, from behind a teacher standing still with her back to the camera, Patricia Elves had asked permission from the school and from the families. Every family had said yes. Every family had said yes immediately. Diane stood in front of it on the second visit before the children arrived at that part of the hall. She looked at herself from behind the back of her head, her shoulders the specific quality of stillness in her posture. She thought about what it looked like from the outside. She thought about how different it looked from the inside. She thought the children who were behind me can see this photograph and know what they were doing. And the children who weren't there can see it and learn something about what it looks like when people decide to keep the record. She thought that is the point of the photograph. That is the point of all of it. She turned when the children arrived. They were lined up in their pairs on the sidewalk outside the glass doors. October again, or November this time, the same gray, flat morning light, the same granite steps. A different class, but many of the same questions, because the unit had not changed and the unit was built to produce those questions. She said, "Let's go in." She had learned to have everything documented not because of October 19th. Before October 19th. Before, and the reason was simple, the record is what makes denial impossible. Ida B. Wells had understood it. Samuel Tobias had understood it. Mamie Till had understood it. Jada Williams, pressing record on a Thursday morning on a public sidewalk at 11 years old, had understood it. Diane Okafor had understood it for 15 years. She taught it the only way she knew how to teach anything that mattered, by doing it herself in front of her students, so that they could see what it looked like when a person decided to be the one who kept the record. She had been doing this for 15 years. She had been doing it in a room where the James Baldwin quote was taped at 30 degrees off level because the things worth reading are never perfectly straight. She had been doing it in a school 3 miles from where she grew up, in a building she had walked into as a young woman who had been a high-need student and who had decided that the best use of what she had survived was to come back and stand in the room so that others could watch someone stand and decide they were not going to be moved. They had been watching. They had learned. They had reached for their phones. If this story meant something to you, subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who kept the record when the record was the only thing that could not be taken away.